Skeleton is all of the bones that make up the long axis of your body and protect your most vital organs. So your cranial bones, which again touch your brain, your facial bones, which make up your face, the two together make up your skull, your vertebral column, your thoracic cage, which has two parts, your ribs and your sternum. So we didn't really talk about the sternum before as the bone of the day, but this is the other part of your thoracic cage, and it's got three parts. This part up here is called the manubrium, this is the body, and this is the xiphoid process. If you've ever been taught CPR, you already know about the xiphoid process. This is what you feel for, and then you put your two fingers there, and you put your palm above that, and then you push with all your might, and it's probably not going to do any good anyway, unless you're breaking those ribs. So just make sure if you're giving CPR, you do it with lots of force. So anyway, how our ribs work is they attach to a costal cartilage on the front and then wrap around and articulate with our vertebrae, our thoracic vertebrae in the back. So those make up the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton is made of the bones of the girdles and the limbs. And our pectoral girdle is this girdle here. We're going to talk more about all of our joints tomorrow, but this has our scapula and our clavicle, all those muscles we just described, and then our humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. For our pelvic girdle, one os coxa has an ilium, an ischium, and a pubis. All of this together makes your pelvis. So part of your pelvis is part of your vertebral column as well. So as far as appendicular skeleton goes, it's just the os coxa in your lower limb. So as far as the pelvis goes, then we've got both bones from both of our skeletons working together in that. So then here we have our femur, our patella, our tibia, fibula. You do need to know calcaneus, talus, all your metatarsals, and then again your phalanges. So we have a lot to look at today. So this breaks down our bones here. In blue are our axial bones and then our appendicular bones. So we've kind of gone over this. The skull is the most complex bony structure in your body. Again, your cranial bones are all those that are touching your brain. So let's talk about that. What's this? It's your skull. This is your frontal bone. I'll just tell you, I'll give you a hint. They're named for parietal bones. These are parietal bones, so they sit right above the lobes that they're by. So then what would these be? The temporal bones. So then what would this be? Occipital bone. So then the weird cranial bones are the ones that don't have lobes named after them, those sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone. So if you look inside your skull, we have these dips that hold the lobes of your brain. I'm not going to have you label a fossa. We've got enough to worry about. I'm going to have you label, I don't know, the olfactory foramina and the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. That's what I'll have you do. So just be aware though, the fossa are dips. So we've got these dips in these bones that hold our brain. If we look in there, you can see then how that works. If we look, this is listing all of our cranial bones. So these ones we kind of can figure out because they have lobes of the brain named by them. Sphenoid and ethmoid bone are kind of weird. So looking in your orbits, you can see your sphenoid bone right here. So it's kind of easiest to see when you look down into your skull though, I think. That's when we can really see the wings of it well. So these are the greater wings of the sphenoid bone and the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. And so you can see that right here is the sphenoid bone. And then sitting right in it is this thing called the sella turcica. So it means Turkish saddle. And this is where your pituitary gland sits. So remember when we were looking at our brains, there's that pituitary sticking off that infundibulum stalk. It sticks down and sits in this Turkish saddle, the sella turcica. This is when they were first doing anatomical studies, the pituitary seemed to be the only thing in the brain that was unpaired. So they thought that's where the soul was. This was called the seat of the soul, the sella turcica there in the sphenoid bone. So you have to be able to recognize that. I think you do need to be able to know your optic canals. So if you look in that sphenoid bone, we've got two nice holes that are nice and round that come out into the orbit. Those are optic canals. And then we have the superior orbital fissures are these slits you can see right here. So you have to be able to identify those too. So those are all markings that we can see in our sphenoid bone. Our inferior orbital fissures are these ones coming down here. We talked about those last week as part of our facial bones. So another bone, another cranial bone, the ethmoid bone here. You can see at the anterior aspect of your skull, it should have holes in it or some kind of markings in a real skull. Those are actual holes that your olfactory epithelium stretches up through. So those are the olfactory epithelium that you find in the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. This pointy part of it that you can feel is like a bony ridge is called the crista galli. So those are all of our cranial bones. And then we have our facial bones down here. We talked about most of our facial bones last week. Your mandible here in the front, your two maxilla that are paired, your nasal bones. You can see your maxillary bones are then coming up into kind of help form the nose as well. Just posterior to that, you have your lacrimal bones. And then inside, forming the nasal septum, we have our perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone that comes down here. And then this is that weird bone called the vomer. That's going to help form the perpendicular plate as well. You can see that, help form the nasal septum as well. And then you can see your maxilla has this palatine process that kind of forms the most inferior border of that. Back here, those palatine bones, your maxillary bones and your palatine bones together form your hard palate that you can see under there. So make sure you check that out and feel comfortable with that. Temporal bone, cranial bone, kind of has these weird different parts that we have to worry about. Last week when we were talking about facial bones, I told you this zygomatic bone in the front is part of your cheekbone. It meets up with this zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So the zygomatic process of the temporal bone meets up with the zygomatic bone. Those two things form the zygomatic arch. That's your cheekbone. So just be aware of that. The petrous part, you do need to be able to identify that this kind of petrified looking part back here is the petrous part. The tympanic part is here where we've got our external and acoustic meatus on the outside, internal acoustic meatus on the inside. This is showing you just kind of the sphenoid bone on its own. We do have blown out skulls that you can like see the individual vomer on and things. It's breaking, so I'll put it out back and you can look at it. Don't mess with it too much. We do also have individual ethmoid bones that you can look at in one of the bags back there. So have a look at that. The different parts of it that you need to identify, the crista galli, the cribriform plate, perpendicular plate, all that jazz. So we went through all these last week, so make sure you're comfortable with them again this week. Other things to talk about, perinatal sinuses. We do have some models of those, so I'll get them out too. So sinuses are these hollow spaces in cranial bones and facial bones that are lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. They secrete a bunch of mucus. They lighten the weight of the skull. The function of them really is to help to warm and humidify air. They help to lighten the skull. And then if you know how to use them right, they can enhance the resonance of your voice. So I'll bust out those models, we can look at them. We've probably all had sinus infections in our life. You can feel the incredible pressure in your bones when they filled with mucus. So that's just kind of an interesting thing to be aware of. So we'll look at those models as well. Vertebral column we talked about as well. One thing that I didn't talk about is the way that our vertebral column curves. So this is one of the things that I did want to talk about. You're going to have to be able to identify cervical vertebrae versus thoracic vertebrae versus lumbar vertebrae. Your sacrum and your coccyx are pretty easy because they're fused. You do have to be able to identify C1 and C2 as individual bones. That's because this is the atlas and the axis. It allows you to do flexion and extension of your head, the occipital bone, and it's joined with the atlas does that, and then the atlas rotating on the axis allows you to do lateral and medial rotation of your head. What I wanted to point out is that we have these curvatures that occur as we go through development. So when you're born, you have a C-shaped spine. I was hoping I left a little picture of the baby in here. I didn't. And so when you're born, you just have a nice rounded C-shaped spine. And as you go through development, you get these two characteristic curvatures. A cervical curvature and a lumbar curvature. And this cervical curvature happens when you start lifting your head and holding your head up. And so as babies are learning to do that and pulling and using those muscles, that's what creates that cervical curvature. And then our lumbar curvatures here, or sorry, thoracic curvatures here, and that just is a normal part of that C-shaped spine. And then we get a lumbar curvature. What might cause that? If this one is when a baby starts holding its head, when they start sitting, standing, walking is actually what helps develop that one the most. So the lumbar curvature develops in the spine when you start walking, or in your vertebral column when you start walking around and pulling on your bones in that way. So just be aware of that. We've kind of already talked about these when we went over the general characteristics. So have a look at all those. Again, make sure you can identify a cervical versus a thoracic versus a lumbar vertebrae. Again, the cervical vertebrae kind of look like anteaters. The lumbar vertebrae kind of look like moose. Thoracic vertebrae kind of look like giraffes. That may or may not help. I think that might be all of the specifics that, yeah, you just have to be able to identify ribs. I don't think you have to be able to identify any specific parts of the rib other than that it's a rib. But an interesting thing to be aware of is that each of your ribs articulates with two spots on your thoracic vertebrae. The head of the rib articulates with the body of your vertebrae, and then we've got this angle of the rib that articulates with the transverse process, costal process on the side of the vertebrae. So it's just kind of an interesting thing to be aware of. So thoracic vertebrae are always easy to identify for me anyway, because of that nice costal facet on these transverse processes. So if you see that, here's the head of the rib on the body of the vertebrae, and then the angle of the rib spreads around. There's a nice smooth articulating surface on the transverse process of every one of your thoracic vertebrae because of that. So just be aware of that. That's fair game for a marking that you would have to identify. So if there was an A right here on the practical and it said what's the marking and what's it for, you'd say, oh, that's the transverse costal facet and it's the articulating surface for the rib. So that's that. Just, we've talked about our girdles before. Our pectoral girdles attach our upper limbs to the body. The pelvic girdle attaches the lower limbs to the body. The pelvis is different than the pelvic girdle. So I do kind of want to talk about that a little bit, because we can see a difference between males and females also in the pelvis. So an entire pelvis has two pelvic girdles and your sacrum and coccyx here. So your true pelvis is all of this stuff down here protected by what's called the pelvic grid. And the false pelvis is kind of everything that could be thought of and imagined in this part. And really, when we think about vital organs, we said the more important something was, the more bone it had around it. So brain and spinal cord, really important. Heart, lungs, really important. If we look at what's going on in here, we've got, you know, like some colon and some small intestine. And sure, down in here we have bladder, but down in here we also have reproductive organs. Reproductive organs, so in our true pelvis we're doing a lot more protection and down in here of kind of that stuff that's necessary for survival of the species. So it just kind of gets a little extra protection in there. One thing to be aware of, you can tell a male from a female pelvis pretty easily by a couple different things. Females' pelvises tend to widen and lengthen out. So we have what's called a pelvic inlet and a pelvic outlet, and both are a lot larger in the female than they are in the male. And another thing you can see, look at this curvature of the sacrum and coccyx between a female and a male. Like males' coccyx and sacrum poke deep into that pelvis, and the female sits back a lot farther. And so what that does is allows for this really big pelvic outlet that can accommodate the passage of an entire head out of the bony skeleton. And a lot of times on females you'll see that that's broken, and she may or may not be aware that that ever happened. So that's that. Just kind of something interesting, the differences that you can observe between the two. And then yeah, our thigh, again, is this kind of more superior part of the lower limb, leg and foot. We've been through all these bones, so you should all be mostly comfortable and ready to dive into lab and test each other. Are there any questions?